So our next speaker, impromptu, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Virginia in 2008 and serves on the Senate Banking, Budget, Commerce, and Intelligence Committees. A true radical centrist, Mark Warner is a national leader of efforts to find bipartisan consensus to create solutions to reduce the federal deficit and debt. He's also a champion for small businesses, including startups and entrepreneurs. Mark Warner earned a law degree from Harvard, but guessing that the world wouldn't miss him as a lawyer, he proceeded directly to the business world, where he became an early leader in the cellular phone industry and co-founded the company that became Nextel. Mark Warner then served as governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. From Richmond, he improved education and economic opportunity while recruiting over 100,000 new jobs to the state of Virginia. Virginia promptly received bipartisan recognition as the best managed state and the best state for business. Senator Warner organized the legendary Gang of Six, which spent more than a year producing a comprehensive plan to cut $4 trillion or more from the national debt. The bipartisan gang has since grown to 45 senators and 100 House members, thereby approaching a bona fide movement. Recently, Warner has been asked to lead a budget committee task force to evaluate the effectiveness of federal agencies and programs. He's a huge supporter of military families and veterans, fighting to get them better housing and health care services. Mark Warner and his wife, Lisa, are engaged in extensive national philanthropic efforts as well. Please welcome Senator Mark Warner.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and my apologies to all. And Ed, it is wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to see everybody from CCIA. You know, Kathy gives that wonderful introduction. She's been a friend for a long time. She forgot to mention the fact that this is one of the wildest jobs, being a United States Senator. I've been a business guy for 25 years. I was a governor for 4 years. There is no job that is more kind of slightly dysfunctional than being a U.S. Senator. And we've been bopping back and forth. And me being a Virginia guy, I've had 3 appointments downtown. We're about to start votes in about 10 minutes. And I actually, as opposed to most members, can actually see from my home in Alexandria, where I work, the Capitol. I have so much more respect as I'm trying to get to New York this afternoon as well, for those members who have to schlep back and forth 10 hours each weekend. Not the topic of my remarks. I'm going to make them brief, and then as our time allows and interest allows, more than happy to take some questions. Kathy gave again a kind introduction about my obsession about the debt and deficit and the Gang of Six, and you know, you can see how well we've done. Still haven't exactly solved that $16 trillion debt problem that we are going to need all of your help on as we approach to the end of this year, because I can assure you, if no matter what side of where you are in the business world, nothing will be more devastating to economic growth in this country, or around the world for that matter, than to see us with a debt crisis. And if you didn't like July and early August of 2011, it will pale in comparison to the kind of financial Armageddon that we have with all the factors of the Bush tax cuts, the sequester cuts, the payroll tax hiatus, all these other things all coming to a head. And I make the case that, you know, that unless and until the business community writ large gets involved in this and helps demand that of our elected representatives, which would mean a balanced approach that takes on entitlements and revenues, you know, we're going to have more of the same that we've seen so far, which I think we've actually been lucky to escape less financial repercussions and market repercussions. And I say this with due respect to our colleagues from abroad. I do believe that in 2012, America's rallying cry should be something other than, hey, at least we're better than the Greeks. Good news, on the good news front, since there are a lot of not so good news, you know, we have done certain things that, again, this industry would appreciate. As somebody who spent 20 years as a venture capitalist and in the technology field, recent piece of legislation that I was strongly an advocate of, the so-called Jobs Act, which took on the issue. I mean, if we're going to have the kind of job growth in this country, we from the politician's standpoint, always talk about small business being the backbone of that job growth. The reality is it's not traditional small business. It's not obviously Fortune 500 companies. It's startup ventures. And perhaps we had too exuberant a market in the 90s, but because of financial crisis, regulatory activities, and others, we basically disappeared a lot of the access to capital that small startup companies have had over the last decade. And we think about your industry, which led our way in the 90s, but outside of the kind of social networking space, hasn't been as dominant in the first century. My industry of telecom wasn't as either. It wasn't as well, and part of that was because we weren't, I think, creating enough startup ventures. This so-called Jobs Act does two things very important. One is it makes appropriate changes in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and others to allow startup companies to access the capital markets in a more efficient way and reopen that avenue. And it also uses the power of the internet and the first step of kind of the democratization of capital raising through the internet through the tools of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, which we may not get totally right, but is a step in the right direction. Combined with that, and another area I'm working on with Jerry Moran, Senator from Kansas, is if we're going to continue to generate the kind of startup, particularly in the technology field, businesses we need, one part is access to capital, another part is access to talent. And we have put together legislation in our so-called Startup Act that also takes on this issue around talent on immigration reform. Finally puts in place the oft-required comment that every American business, for the most part, says is, why not staple that green card to that graduate degree, particularly in STEM fields? This doesn't quite go that far, but it does create a whole new category of visas for those graduate students in the STEM fields beyond a bachelor's degree, additional 50,000 that would allow, if those job opportunities then present themselves in this country, rather than sending folks home. At the same time as people graduate from the H-1B program, we create a new entrepreneur's visa, again, that will disproportionately be in your industry, in our industry, that would say if you can get independent funding of about $100,000 and show a path to hire at least a minimum of 2 Americans, you can also have a path to grow that business in this country. And again, technology/computers, no industry has reflected more of that kind of growth from first-generation Americans than the tech field. Third thing I want to mention, and then be happy to take questions, is in an area that I need, candidly, some additional education in, because while I was in VC and in telecom and IT for about 20 years, I am increasingly concerned as we kind of try to sort through, which we don't seem to have done very well, questions around intellectual capital and the kind of massive wave of new protective patent acquisition, which seems to me, from at least a business standpoint, maybe about the kind of worst misallocation of resources that we've seen in recent times. We seem to have taken, we passed a small patent reform bill last year, and if anything, it seems to have accelerated that acquisition. I think it's great that companies are making windfalls on these patents, but sure, from a macroeconomic standpoint, probably is not the right path. And sorting through that from a policy standpoint, and I know the patent issue has been here for some time, but we're going to need some additional help. There are a lot of new members, and I think members that would be very sympathetic to it. Final point I want to mention, again, before questions, is your help and assistance. And I know this is, again, can very quickly devolve into a discussion in the weeds. But we need the industry's help and support as we sort through the cyber threats. I sit on the Intel committee right now, and I will only say that my view of the top threat that faces our economy, and for much of the West's economy, is less the actions of individual or even small groups of terrorist cells, and much more the very real threat of cyber, the very real threat of intellectual property theft. And this is coming from both criminal elements, terrorist elements, and at least semi-sanctioned efforts by foreign nations. I know this raises an enormous specter of potential additional government regulation, and trying to define what falls inside and outside the critical infrastructure bucket is tough. But I can assure you that kind of some of the legislation that's out there right now that kind of views this only on the voluntary basis. Here's the only concern I would put across your bow. I would be very afraid of a voluntary regime without some level of standards. And then, God forbid, we have a significant cyber breach, particularly in a critical infrastructure. And as we've seen in other areas, you would, I believe, then have such an overreactive legislative response. And I think we saw that in the aftermath of 9/11 in a number of fields. But you could have such an overreactive legislative response that what looks challenging now would be looked upon as minor in comparison. So please do not, this is a very, very difficult issue, and an issue that, frankly, I'm not sure it's evolving so quickly that most members are up to speed on. And as somebody who, again, comes with some background, I'm hanging on by my fingernails, still trying to learn this. But we need your voice in this on a forward-looking basis. I know, we start getting into definitions of critical infrastructure, particularly on the telecom and IT side, and we are treading in dangerous grounds. But help us get ahead of this curve. So my thanks to Kathy, my thanks to my long friendship with Ed as well, and for allowing me to kind of intervene at this point, recognizing that I have jumped line. I would be, though, infringe a little bit more upon your time if anybody's got a question, comment, suggestion, or criticism before I go off and deal with the Violence Against Women Act. Yes, please. And if you could just tell me who you are, too.
My name is David Warbuff, and I work with a company called Tivio out of Boston. And my question is about your wearing your Intel outfit, let's say, from your committee. And we do work with BASLA and 24th Air Force and your Cybercom and the whole group that's dealing with cyber, the issues you're talking about. But one of the issues we have is we have a board member that's not from the United States. And so from your Intel hat again, there's a lot of blockades from us providing capability to the warfighter because of the non-U.S. ownership issues of our company. So any suggestions or help that you can do with that would be appreciated.
Very valid concern. As I sort through, one of the things I'm still figuring out, I'm a newbie on the Intel committee on a relative basis of last year. I never know at what point, they shoot me if I say something, so I try to err on the side of discretion. But as somebody who used to be in the telecom business and knew some of the restrictions there and dealt in the Canadian, I'm familiar with the issue. I'm not deep enough. If you could get something to my office, I need to look into. I get it. And as somebody who was a venture capitalist that sponsored a lot of companies that had, foreign ownership and foreign board members, we gotta sorting through a way to do this rationally, but in a way that also protects the very real security interests. Help me with some ideas here. But great point. Please, Neitha, raise your hand. Get her the information. Okay. Others.
Let me jump in, but if you guys need to wave your hand violently. Congressional jurisdiction, dangerous place to tread. And I'm not trying to do it per se, but the role of IP has become so significant to our industry, and the systems are confused and good and bad, there are problems. But I think a lot of us have a feeling that the Commerce Committee does have the sense of you're responsible for the system of commerce. Okay, judiciary, as a bunch of lawyers, a lot of us are lawyers, but looking at this from legalistic way, especially from legal regimes that are old and probably obsolete, office leads us down a blind alley. That we really need to make sure that, and I'm not saying calling for overreaching, wide solution, attempts at big legislation, but the question needs to be asked is, what's the impact on the ecosystem? What's the impact in general? Not as, okay, we're going to solve this, an infringement issue, or we're going to solve this issue and do it in the stovepipe way. And I guess I don't know how you do it in terms of more joint committee hearings, whatever, but the systemic approach, how do we protect electronic commerce? How do we enhance this tremendous internet and innovation machine as we try to solve these problems? So the real question is, for Congress, I think, is how do we create a world in which internet and innovation and economic growth can prosper and grow? And that's our goal. Now, we have to solve a lot of problems along the way, but solving those problems can't be more paramount to looking at it and keeping a healthy system operating.
You know, Ed, one of the things, Ed is you all have a great guy that represents your industry here. Ed is one of the real veterans in the business, has been in Washington a lot longer than I've been and a lot longer than I'd want to be. And he just asked, though, a remarkably cheap shot question. I say that affectionately because he has touched, you think about, taxes, entitlement reform. Those are nothing compared to committee jurisdiction. You could give a much better treatise than I on how wacky it is, and the fact that we have basically a committee jurisdiction system that was set up for the earliest 20th century economy. It makes virtually no sense right now. I was a former governor. I never completely understood why there was not rational federal transportation policy. I get it now because at least on the Senate side it's divided in 3 buckets. But this is I'd love to figure out if there are a way on, I think previous Senates have looked at task forces and, they have had mixed results. You would, again, know better than I. But this notion of joint jurisdiction, or at least joint hearings, so people kind of get up to the same knowledge curve, makes enormous sense to me. I'm not in management. But you would be, this sounds like an insider Washington question, but you would all be shocked if you knew how big an issue that Ed has just touched upon. Until you're there, until you're working on this stuff on a daily basis, you would not realize the way boundaries are guarded, and by all the committee chairs, in both, and that didn't even get to the question of the kind of House, Senate, which are, more than Venus, Mars in terms of 2 institutions that are only 150 yards apart, but in completely 2 different worlds. I didn't give you a very good answer, but I don't have a very good answer for it. So if you got an idea, I'm happy to push. Please.
Senator, thank you for joining us, and thanks for all the hard work you do and have done over the course of your career, both in the tech industry and in government. Let me ask, this whole sequestration process and tax law expiration and this whole train wreck that you can see coming, and the bridge is out, and it's about to happen. Do you see this realistically ending up with some sort of extension of the sequestration agreement, the Bush tax cut law, and kicking it over into the first 6 months of the next Congress? Or, there doesn't seem to be any deadline the system is capable of keeping and working toward.
Well, I think it depends upon, and to a certain degree, the outcome of the elections this year. If there's dramatic change, then there's going to be enormous pressure to say, kick it into the next year. If there is kind of rearranging but not dramatic change, kicking down into the next year does not do anything, because I think an additional postponement in light of the fragility of Europe, that I don't think we're going to get away with the kind of relative slap on the wrist of one of the rating agencies' downgrade and, frankly, looking as the least of the bad after we had the fiasco, when I think the political class in this country did more to harm our economy with that fiasco leading up to August of 2011 than ever. So I don't think we'll have a chance to punt again unless there's major change in the elections, number one. Number two, it's one of the reasons why my group and others, we need to be doing the hard work now. Simpson-Bowles, I think, is still, which was the Gang of Sixes approach, is still a great framework. But that document was very much a 2010 document, and baselines and things need to be changed. And I've got, and beyond just kind of the, some of the policies need to be changed as well. And there are those of us trying to work that now from a policy standpoint, so that we'll be ready. Number three, there are very real questions. I'm a Democrat. I support the president. But I desperately want this to be solved. This is more important than any particular, frankly, any political figure, or Lord knows any political party. And with that sense, do you have this question of how much do we force our presidential candidates in advance of the election? I keep thinking back to that, Republican presidential debate where all the candidates were forced into saying they wouldn't take a deal of 10-to-1 cuts over revenue increases. I can assure you that with federal spending at 25% of our GDP and revenues at 15% of our GDP, both all-time highs and lows, you ain't going to get there on one side of the balance sheet. The only time we've had budget balance in the last 70 years is when spending and revenue has been at 20, roughly, plus or minus a point. So, this notion that we're just going to tax rich people, or we're just going to, nip and tuck around a program or two, leaving defense and others out, ain't going to get it. And there are those of us in my state, two last points on this. My state is as dependent upon defense spending as any state in the nation. And I think the sequester cuts would be a disaster for our defense and for our country. But I am not going to be one that's going to punt on those and say, well, let's just take the part that's going to help protect Virginia, or as much important as defense, out off the burner. Because I would go back to Admiral Mullen, the greatest threat to this country is not terrorism, the greatest threat is our debt and deficit. So we need this comprehensive solution. And my last point on this, and you guys are lucky because I'm not making you sit through, which some of you have seen, sit through the whole PowerPoint presentation where I could absolutely, I would take my chances on convincing you all that we could actually reach 90% of an agreement in 2 hours. I don't care what your political party is or even what your political persuasion view is, rational people can get to a solution set here. But we will not get to a solution set until each and every one of you, those of you who are American, take off just your corporate hat and put on your American hat and help demand that of our elected officials. And if not, we all get fired. There was an effort, I think, ill-timed in the House recently when there was the week of the budget debate around the House. And again, for those of you who are not insiders, this is kind of inside baseball. But there was an effort to put up the Simpson-Bowles approach, and I begged them not to do it. Democrat and Republican said, we're going to put it up. We've been waiting too long. Funny thing happened. During that day, there was a moment in time, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when there was a path that was going to win. We started with 100. There were 60 Democrats, 40 Republicans. We were picking up a bunch more Republicans. All the Democrats, maybe to embarrass the Republicans, were going to vote for it. And there was this holy heck moment. And then the institutional forces on both the left and right turned on the switch and beat people up, and by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock that night, it got down to 38 votes for it. And the point of that was two lessons. One, there is very little or virtually no institutional support for elected officials to do the right thing. And that is a sad state of affairs in our country, because the forces on the status quo are always going to argue about why you can't do something. And secondly, and I say this as the most pro-business guy, at least on the Democratic side, there is. But I have been embarrassed by the business community's response, at least in the summer of 2011's reaction. I begged everybody to get involved in the debate. And I basically got, well, Warner, you're right, but we don't want to make Congressman X or Senator Y mad. Until and unless we realize that this, as important as all of our individual industry issues are, that this trumps all of them, that nothing would be worse for all of your businesses than to see a 400 or 500 basis point interest rate spike, we're not going to get it done. We desperately need the business community in this fight.
In that sense, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, the administration never did embrace Simpson-Bowles. And the time that it came out, it was right after the midterm election, which might have been the safest time to have actually done it. But fear of offending the base prevented that from happening then.
I would make 2 points.
Is that, can that
Yeah,
still
no,
be
no.
the framework, and is it possible to
2 points
get-
on that. No, I think it's a fair critique. Although I do, from the micro standpoint, would like to remind everybody that Simpson Bowles came out 4 days before maybe the president's high point when he cut the deal with the Republicans to extend all the Bush tax cuts. So there would have been a bit of hypocrisy saying, let's cut $4 trillion out of the debt, when 4 days later we added close to $1 trillion by punting on all the problems, which everybody said was a great act of bipartisan. Bipartisan is mostly code in Washington for both sides agreeing not to pay for something. One of the reasons why I voted against the payroll tax cut, even though we needed the stimulus, we wasn't paid for. And the president did come out when the so-called Gang of Six came out and supported it wholeheartedly. It was at that moment when we lost an awful lot of the Republican support because anything the president's for, some folks are going to be against. I do think one of the reasons why I still keep, beyond the fact that there's nothing that's nearly as important as trying to get this right, is that, the value of something bipartisan coming out of the Senate, we can take the first round of arrows. And whether that's a President Obama or a President Romney. But, the appeal I make to all you is that, and I make this everywhere, this is not just y'all, but, we're going to need you at some point over the next 6 to 9 months to be in the trenches with us. There are 145 members who've signed up to do the right thing. I would like nothing more than those of you who are kind of on the political side within your companies, that as you're asking the issues on who you're going to support and not support in a very bipartisan way, asking folks to also have on each of your industry questionnaires, add something on fiscal responsibility. I'll take one last one before they give me the hook. I know they're giving me the evil eye. Anybody else got it? Anyone else, or I'll cede the floor back?
If there's one, I do have one thing I'd like, no, okay. Go ahead,
Ronald.
Ron. You got me.
Pardon? All right. A lot of common issues.
Whenever they start talking about voluntary here on the data stuff, I think of our tax system, which is a voluntary system of self-assessment. It's anything but voluntary, but that's the theory. So we're real concerned, we run online services, that voluntary is not voluntary whenever it does with the government. So, or it's just temporarily voluntary. How are they going to define voluntary without backing it up with the coercive power of the state?
Yeah, that's why in this, I'm still thinking through this, so I'm not, this is not some Warner definitive position. But in terms of standards and information sharing, I think we will get moved into ultimately some kind of system that has some teeth to it. And I would rather tailor that from the front end rather than this kind of half-baked voluntary approach where some people are doing the appropriate protections and others are not. And then you end up with somebody who is not getting penetrated and having some result that is traumatic to our security or environmental ecosystem, and everybody is penalized. And again, we could have a difference of opinion. I could be convinced differently on this. But I think we will end up at some point, whether short-term or long-term, with some level of standards here. You just can't. The amount of as you would probably know, both theft, intellectual property stealing, outright theft in terms of money, in terms of our financial institutions, intellectual property theft, and the level of number of disruptive attacks that take place on a daily basis. If the American people had any sense of that, they would be astonished. And the number of companies who for legitimate business reasons probably don't want to share that information right now, but having some framework for this is really, really going to be important. But I guess I'm agreeing with you that the notion that voluntary only is going to push towards a standard that you're going to have to meet, so why don't we just go ahead and put a standard out there with an appropriate phase-in time that can be narrowly enough tailored that tries to get at this. And I think that's going to be a constantly evolving area. I think it's changed dramatically in the last 2 years. With that, let me again thank Kathy for her friendship. Let me thank Ed for all the great work he does, other than the fact that he asked me about those jurisdictional committee jurisdictions, which, by the way, in the land of, broadband, I'm sure already I have committee chairmen be mad at me by now, or their staffs. But, in my final point that I'd all ask you is, you guys are the growth industry, one of the major growth industries of our economy. We need you to be successful. I want you to be successful. You come from the background, the telecom and IT background that I came from. But we also need you in this kind of political battle, regardless of your partisan affiliation, in supporting rational people to get the job done when it comes to this, into this year. Thank you all very much.